You've heard it many times in the mainstream media. Young men love Reform UK. It seems to have received wisdom in many journalistic circles that Nigel Farage and his TikTok antics, plus Reform UK's anti-woke marketing, have been winning over the hearts and minds of left-behind young men in this country. Nobody seems to have stopped to ask one really important question. Is it actually true? Now, polling for this has been relatively thin on the ground. Not that the mainstream media haven't tried to just ignore this lack of data. Take this article from business magazine City AM from February earlier this year. Why are so many young men turning to Reform? Young men are flocking to Reform because Nigel Farage is telling them what they want to hear, and they have a voice and that it matters, says Oliver Dean. In the article, they make a lot of good arguments as to why young people feel aggrieved with an economy that does not value their interests. Poor wages, sky-high house prices and rents, for example. Yet the evidence of young men voting for Reform UK is patchy at best. They cite general election survey data by YouGov that states that only 12% of 18 to 24 men voting for Reform UK in the last election. That's the same amount of young men that voted for the Green Party, and less than a third of those who voted for Labour. They did cite a very small poll by JL Partners that surveyed 201 16 to 17-year-olds that showed support amongst the youngest Gen Z men for Reform was as high as 35%, however. This is, however, a small sample size. This represents just 30 Reform UK voters who are actually surveyed. Here's another article alleging a potential Reform UK youthquake, this time from SW Londoner. Support for Reform UK grows among young voters. Young people are now increasingly more open to supporting Reform UK, voting intention polls from More in Common show. The latest figures indicate that among 25 to 34-year-olds, support for Reform peaked at 23%, whilst for 18 to 24-year-olds, support reached 16%. Now, as they said, they're citing data from More in Common there about young men supporting Reform. The data cited from More in Common shows that on average, support for Reform amongst men hovers around 20%. Nothing to scream from the rooftops about, but not inconsequential numbers either. But then the article itself concludes that it is in fact not young people who are Reform UK voting, Reform UK is seeing most of their gains from. Despite an increase in young people voting for Reform, support rarely goes beyond 20%. Support for the party remains strongest amongst older demographics, particularly between the ages of 65 and 74, where it reached 28% in April 2025. So, what other data do we have? In the crosstabs for every YouGov poll since they fermented a sustained lead in the polls, Reform UK have not polled higher than 11% amongst 18 to 24s. Meaning that even if 0 young women had surveyed would vote Reform, that's a maximum of just 22% of young men voting for Reform, well below the level they poll at with older voters, which is where the bulk of their support comes from. Now, this is not to say they won't vote for Reform. Young men are disenfranchised and need to have policy directed towards them to ensure they are not enticed by the easy answers and grand promises of Nigel Farage. Men are now less likely to go to university, have declining trade union membership, and are more likely to work in the private sector. All indicators that they are more likely to lean right. So if these trends continue, we may see more younger Gen Z men join the Reform UK fold. What of young women, however? Given all the media hype around the mythical propensity for young men to support Reform UK, there's been very little coverage of young people, and especially young women's propensity for voting for the Green Party. If we bring back the election results last year, 23% of 18 to 24 women voted for the Greens, far more than what even the most generous polls currently show for 18 to 24 men voting Reform. Yet, total radio silence of this fact in the mainstream media. And this level of support has only grown over time. The Greens reached their all-time highest polling average recently, driven by an increased number of younger Green voters. Curtis, now, of course, this is different to on the continent what you see in countries like Germany, for example, where young men are increasingly voting very heavily for the far right and in actual elections rather than in polls. But what do you make of this data? What's unique about the UK, do you think, in this regard? Will there be a Reform UK youthquake amongst young men? And why do you think the media just completely ignores the surge in young people supporting the Green Party?
Well, before I talk about the Green Party, I want to touch upon Reform. I think there are two things at play here. Number one, the mainstream media narrative is they like to sort of add the ideological bent to a particular political party. What do I mean by that? Well, you can have someone vote for Reform and the media will say, oh, it looks like that Gen Z or a particular cohort of people are moving to the right because they voted for a right-wing party. But it's not as simple as that. There's more nuance. Again, as I said earlier, I've spoken to many Reform people, and it's very different to the way the mainstream media sort of represents these people. You can have a conversation with someone, and yes, all right, when it comes to social and cultural issues, they're pretty reactionary, and then they might say something very, very left-wing. So it's not as simple as well, actually, people don't think in terms of left or right. So it's not as simple as categorizing it as that. So I think what's happening is people are just responding to their material conditions. And actually, that's an opportunity for the left. It's not that, a cohort of young people are moving towards the right and they're the lost generation. In fact, the left can win these people over. You just need to sell a story. Now, of course, I understand when it comes to social and cultural issues, things that we should all defend, but the mainstream media makes it rather difficult to navigate that. But when it comes to class, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to material needs, it's where the left is at its strongest. And that's where we can build a coherent narrative to bring people over. But I mentioned there were two things. The second thing is that doesn't mean that there isn't a drift with young men. It's absolutely true that if you're a young Gen Z man, you're more likely to be a bit more right wing than young women. That's even the case for all age groups, right? So we shouldn't ignore that. It's very, very important that we realize that. But if we look at, across Europe, even look at France, Le Pen, she was doing very well with younger people because the competition at that time was Macron. And what Keir Milburn said, he wrote for Novara last year, I think I agree with this analysis. It's not that necessarily people are moving to the right because they like it. You've had a complete collapse in the centre ground. And in the absence of a strong left-wing voice, people are just going to the right. And I think that's where a lot of the reform support comes from. People are sick and tired of the same old parties, and they feel as though reform are offering something different. And again, I think that transcends age. The left, once again, has to have a broad, sort of a strong left-wing narrative. Now, in terms of the Greens, why aren't the Greens sort of being talked about as much? I mean, that is just confounded across the entire media. The media do tend to ignore them, so that doesn't surprise me. The question is why. Some people might be thinking, oh, is it some sort of conspiracy to deplatform the Greens? I mean, it is with some people. I mean, there are people within legacy media who are like, I absolutely do not want to platform these ideas. In fact, again, it's another anecdote, but we've had multiple times where we've gone to like a Green Party conference and we've spoken to people from Sky and BBC, sort of lower level journalists, who say we absolutely should be covering this stuff more. And they talk to their bosses or they try and speak to someone higher up and the bosses aren't interested. Now, broadly, why is that? It's because the left, whether they are inside the Labour Party or outside the Labour Party, are not seen as serious political actors. That has been the case for a long, long time. So there's no intellectual curiosity from the mainstream media to look at left-wing politics or left-wing political parties, because again, they are not seen as serious. And in terms of Nigel Farage, uniquely, I think the media are obsessed with Farage. Now, it's quite funny and ironic that Farage tries and paints himself as anti-establishment, but he's been in politics for decades. He's got big name recognition. And I think the BBC and the rest of the corporate media are so infatuated with him. Not necessarily that they like him, but they love talking about him. And that often covers up a lot of the important gains the Green Party makes.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There is obviously a systemic issue at play when it comes to the fulcrum of the important policy, which is economic policy. There are sets of material interests that Reform UK are in line with and Greens are opposed to, which is why one narrative is far more popular than the other amongst those mainstream media outlets. I would agree with you there.